Alright. What's going on?
Little no-
Why is this going on? There we go. Let's update it. It's 56 through question mark. Hopefully 100. Or whenever I get through. Alright. So, let's make sure everything's running and then let's get started. Yep. So, we're continuing off with attention. Hopefully, we can get to page 100. And then we can say we're 1/3 done with the 300-page document. Alright. Attention. Divided attention, selective attention, inattention, blindness, and change blindness. So divided attention is a limited resource. It can't split it. You can't split it very well. Doing 2 times at once, you end up switching between tasks rather than doing them simultaneously. Divided attention occurs when an individual must perform 2 tasks which requires attention simultaneously. So that makes sense. Divided attention is basically multitasking, but you're not technically multitasking because you need to focus on one thing at a time. Joined attention is the focusing of attention on an object by 2 separate individuals. So a joint attention is 2 people working together to build a puzzle. Let's just say. Directed attention allows for attention to be focused sustainably on a single task, against a single orientation. So that makes sense. Divided is you're working on 2 different tasks at the same time. Directed, you're focusing on one. So attention in general is the focus or concentrating on something on exclusively to one stimuli compared to the environment. So when you divide your attention on one task between 2 things, watching TV, you're exercising your selective attention. You're selecting one at a time. So it's like a flashlight for your attention. Move around at a spot. Give a moment illuminating one interest rather than the other. Selective attention is the ability to maintain attention while being presented with masking or interfering stimuli. So that is like listening to music and driving at the same time. 2 types of cues that can direct our attention: exogenous and endogenous. Exogenous are external cues. Don't have to tell ourselves to look for them in order for them to capture our attention. Exogenous tend to be bottom up or external events. A review of bottom up is we're using our external stimulus to promote inductive reasoning. Endogenous cues or internal cues require internal knowledge to understand the cue and intention to follow. So, endogenous cues are using top-down thinking, like using deductive reasoning. So, endo means inside. So, think like endothelium or, endothelial cells. They're on the inside, so they're going to be internal cues. So, the cocktail party effect is the ability to concentrate on one's voice amongst a crowd or whenever someone calls your name. So that's what relates to the hit miss theory. In attentional blindness, aka perceptual blindness, we're aware of things not in our visual field, our attention is directed somewhere in that field. So, example, is we can't find Where's Waldo for a minute. Inattentional blindness is the inability to recognize an unexpected object, event, or stimulus that's in plain sight. This is due to a physiological lapse in attention rather than a defect or deficient sensory perception. That we can't say where the nearest fire extinguisher is because you fail to notice it's because your attention is typically elsewhere. This is true even though fire extinguishers are brightly colored and central to survival. Change blindness. So change blindness fails to notice changes from previous to current state in an environment. So different from inattentional blindness, a subtle but important difference. Don't notice your mom gets a haircut. So you don't notice change. Okay? Let's mark that one because it's interesting. Distal stimuli. Distal stimuli are objects and events in the world about you. Aware of and respond to this is what is important. Proximal stimuli are the patterns of stimuli from these objects and events that actually reach your senses. It's the light that is actually falling on your retina. Okay? Covert orienting is the act of bringing the spotlight of attention on an object or event without the body or eye movement. Overt orienting, a person turns all part of the body to alter it to get sensory impact. So overt, you can remember, is obviously moving. So you have to obviously orient yourself. Attentional capture occurs when attention is attracted by the motion of an object or stimulus. The next syndrome occurs when damage to the brain causes a change or loss in the capacity of the spatial dimension of a divided attention. Vigilance attention and signal detection are processes that attempt to detect a signal or target of interest. It allows responses to primed and quick actions undertaken in response to a single or target of interest. Example, a pothole in a road is detected to avoid as actions are undertaken. Vigilance is a type of attention. These types of attentions often describe a main function rather than a subfunction. So vigilance action is you're actually actively trying to defend or change a behavior. You'd be vigilant of like a threat or something. Previous practice on any skill will improve performance, while too high arousal states can be detrimental attention. Enhanced arousal can enhance attention. A person who is skilled at a task will require less attention to complete that task. Difficult or novel tests will require more attention than a practice or skill test. Alerting attention is affected by regular aging, but deficiencies are not associated with schizophrenia. Neurotransmitter modulation is this attentional network associated with norepinephrine produced in the locus ceruleus. Orienting attention involves the capacity to change the focus of attention from one stimulus to another. This network is predominantly modulated by acetylcholine produced in the basal forebrain. The basal forebrain is a collection of structures located in front of and below the striatum. It includes the nucleus accumbens, nucleus basis, and medial septum nuclei. These nucleus are important for production of acetylcholine, which is distributed widely throughout the brain. The basal forebrain is considered to be the major cholinergic output of the central nervous system. Okay? So the basal forebrain, it controls movement. Production of movement, a contracting muscle. Executive attention is involved in goal-directed behavior, monitoring conflicts between internal processes and anticipating the effects of the behavior. Dopamine from the ventral tegment area is associated with executive attention. Okay. Theories of selective attention. How do we filter out unimportant information? How do we decide what to shift our attention to something new? Example, you're in a loud room and you still attend to one person who is talking to you. So hear information that you're not attending to. So we have selective attention, ability to focus on a task at hand while ignoring other information. Shadowing tasks is an experiment that studies selective attention. Okay, something I need to review. In this test, you're wearing headphones and they have two different sounds in each. Left ear hears one thing, right ear hears another. Don't repeat everything said in one ear and ignore the other. Focus on one ear and ignore the other. Selective attention. Based on the unintended information that we do and don't end up comprehending, we can hear about how selective attention works by seeing what they can filter out in each other's ear. There's three theories. The Broadbent early selection theory. All information in the environment goes into a sensory register, which then is received, and then all the info gets transferred to a selective filter right away, which identifies when you are supposed to be attending to physical characteristics and filter out stuff on intended ear. And finally, information moves to the perceptual processes, identifies friend voices and assigning meaning to words. Then you can engage in other cognitive processes such as deciding how to respond. So this would probably be essential for this theory. Sensory register, selective filter, perceptual process, conscious. Some problems, if you completely filter out unintended information, be able to identify your own name in an unintended ear, but you can explain by the cocktail party effect. So this is just a diagram showing that you're collecting all the stimulus, it goes through a sensory register, it goes through a selective filter, perceptual process determines the meaning and other cognitive processes. Okay. So for D&D's late selection theory, you place broad band selective filter after perceptual process. This means you do register and assign everything meaning, but then in a selective filter decides what you pass on to conscious. So the late selection theory moves the selective filter from before perception to do after the perceptual process. So a sensory register to perceptual process, selective filter, conscious. So basically, the only thing different from the early is that it's after perceptual process. We're going to process everything, but we're going to select against what we respond to psychology. What is the problem? This whole process has to occur quickly, but given limited resources and attention, knowing our brains are super seems wasteful to spend all the effort assigning meaning to things first, which you don't need. The acronym, the Dutch pay attention to everything. Okay. Interesting. And then we have the Treisman attenuation theory. Instead of completely selective filtering, have attenuator weakness that doesn't eliminate input from unintended ear. Then some gets to the perceptual process, so still assigns meaning to stuff in unintended ear, just not high priority. Then switch to something important. So the Treisman attenuation theory replaces the selective filter with an attenuator. Selectively allows the intended message to be processed to a greater extent than the unattended. So we have a sensory register, attenuator, perceptual process, and conscious. So acronym, Treisman is sharp as a T. And he is smart enough to know attenuate and then perceive. Later experiments show that difficulty of the task being attended can affect what filters occur and how long it takes. John and Hines proposed that the location of information in the attenuator is able to be varied by the listener depending on the demand necessities for a particular attention task. So the acronym Johnson & Johnson, Heinz, ketchup can be anywhere. I get what they did there. Johnson & Johnson and Heinz ketchup can be anywhere. Still debated about which theory is best, but all theories are pivotal in our understanding of selective attention. Important to consider because attention is important to all cognitive functions we perform. Got it. The spotlight model of attention multitasking. Okay. So the selective attention is we take information from our body, but we don't consciously process it at all. So what we said earlier. Your eyes see everything, but don't attend to it consciously. We attend to only small amounts of information at a time, but we see a lot of the information. The spotlight model of attention, the selective attention takes info from 5 senses, but pays attention to everything. Where things on an unconscious level, example priming, where exposure to one stimulus affects response to another stimulus, even if we haven't been consciously paying attention to it. We are primed to respond to our name. Why is it a strong prime for pulling our attention? Resource model of attention. So, spotlight model attention, before we move on, is like certain stimuli are a priming factor that would promote us to respond to or pull our attention to that significant detail. Research model of attention is we have limited resources in attention. Resources that are easily overtasked if we try to pay attention to multiple things at once. So it's basically saying multitasking is difficult because we have limited resources for our attention. And it makes it over difficult to focus on many things. Both models say something about our ability to multitask, not very good at it, supported by research. Yeah, I was just talking about that. Okay. Multitasking and divided attention. What about talking on a phone or texting while driving? Maybe not multitasking, just switching spotlights, attention back and forth. Results in a high number of car accidents. What about singing along to a song or talking to a passion while driving? The three factors have an influence on our ability to perform multiple tasks at once. Task similarity. So 3 factors: task similarity, task difficulty, and practice. Okay? So task similarity listens to the radio or listening to an interview while writing a paper. Better to listen to classical music because harder to multitask with a similar task. You don't multitask with music. So, task difficulty, harder tasks require more focus. Texting while driving is more difficult than talking to a passenger in the car. Also, you turn off and down the radio in unfamiliar town because driving requires more focus. It becomes a harder task. And then practice. Activities well practiced become automatic processes, or things that occur without need for attention. Whether a task is automatic versus controlled is determined by the amount of practice. Controlled task is harder and would struggle to compete if attention is divided. And in general, multitasking. Multitasking is not as efficient as working on a single task, even though the tasks are relatively similar. This is true when it comes to learning as well. By studying, this is true when it comes to learning as well. High levels of text messaging while studying correlates to poor student grades. Alright, after hearing that statement, let's try not to have divided attention, and just have selective attention for just studying. So, moving on to memory. So let's look at the informational process model of memory, sensory working and long-term memory. Okay, an information processing model processes our brain are similar to computers. We get input from an environment, process it, output decisions. Doesn't describe where things happen in the brain. We get input, we process, and then we output. Brain processing is a bottom-up or stimulus-driven model. Memory processing model assumes limited storage capacity. The human brain is believed to have a limited capacity for attention. The information processing assumes serial processing. However, the human brain has a capacity for parallel processing. Okay. First stage is getting the input. It occurs in the sensory memory, the sensory register, where you first interact with the information in your environment. Temporary registers all the information in your senses you're taking in. The sensory memory, the register, is the two components based on the type of input. You have iconic memory for what you see lasts half a second, and echoic, which you hear, which lasts 3 to 4 seconds. Okay? Partial report technique is a report one part of the whole field in a cued recall. The partial report condition requires participants to identify a subset of the characters from a visual display using cued recall. The cue was a tone which sounded at various time intervals followed the onset of the stimuli. The frequency of the tone indicated which set of characters within the display were to be reported. Due to the fact that participants did not know which row would be cued for recall, performance in the partial reported condition can be regarded as a random sample of the observer's memory for an entire display. Cypher revealed that immediately after stimulus onset, participants could recall most letters, 9 out of 12 letters in a given row, showing that 75% of the entire visual display is accessible to memory. Okay. The whole report technique, the whole report containers require participants to recall as many elements from original display, proper spatial location as possible. Participants were typically able to recall 3 to 5 characters from a 12. This suggests the whole report is limited by a memory with a capacity of 4 to 5 terms. Okay. The working memory is the sensory information you actually process. It's what I'm using right now to think of examples. Not at the moment. Capacity is magic, number 7. Working memory can hold 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of info at a time. Why phone numbers are 7 digits long does vary past on how complicated it's to or how old you are. Different components is to process. Working memory is a memory that's stored while it is held in attention. Explains the serial position effect, primacy and recency effect. Processing occurs at the visual, spatial, sketchpad, and phonological loop. Visual spatial sketchboard, the visual plus spatial info are processed in a phonological loop, such as verbal info is processed repeating a phone number to yourself. Phonological storage is believed that the phonological storage capacity is around 2 seconds. What about a visual plus verbal info, like a map that has street names and landmarks? Needing coordination of the visual spatial sketchboard and the phonologic, the central executive fills that role. The central executive tells the visual spatial sketchboard plus the phonologic loop to coordinate. The central executive supervises the cognitive process of the memory. This creates an integrated representation that stores in its episodic buffer, which acts as a connector for information to be stored in a long-term memory. The dual coding hypothesis says it's easier to remember words associated with images than either one alone. It's called the method of loci. Imagine moving through a familiar place and in each place leaving a visual representation on a topic to be remembered. So the dual coding hypothesis is saying that your method of loci, so you're going to walk through a house and give like a direction linked with that. Operational span testing is a task in which subjects are asked to perform a simple mathematical verification. Example, 4 divided by 2 plus 1. And then read a word with a recall test from following some words with the verifying pairs. The maximum number of words that can be recalled is the operation span. The final stage is long-term memory. Long-term memory is the capacity to unlimited two main categories, explicit and implicit. Is unlimited. Explicit is declarative or facts or events you can clearly explicitly describe. Explicit memory is a type of long-term memory that focuses on recalling previous experience and information. Explicit memories can be divided into two categories, episodic and somatic. Anytime you take vocabulary tests or state capitals, you're using somatic memory. It's remembering simple facts like the meanings of words. Second type is episodic, like your last birthday party. Implicit memory are non-declarative involved with things you may not articulate. Implicit is a type of memory which reviews previous experience to aid our performance. So riding a bike is an example, which involves procedural memories, which is included in implicit memory. All memories formed for conditioning are implicit memories. Implicit memories are formed unconsciously. All habitats are procedural memories, a type of implicit memory. All habits are procedural memories. That makes sense. Memories that inform unconscious motor skills are procedural memories. Procedural memory is a long-term memory for action or habits such as how to kick a ball or washing hands before eating. Procedural memory is a type of implicit memory. Habit learning occurs in a specific type of implicit memory. Habit/explicit memory is stored in the basal ganglia. Implicit memories are non-declarative unconscious, while explicit memories are declarative unconscious. Other is priming. Previous experience influences current interpretation of events. Priming is an implicit memory effects in which exposure to one stimulus is the response of another. So what we talked about earlier in the cognition theories. So negative priming is an implicit memory effect in which prior exposure to a stimulus unfavorable influences the response to the same stimulus. So let's repeat that because I'll start to zone out a little bit. Negative priming is an implicit memory effect in which prior exposure to a stimulus unfavorably influences the response to the same stimulus. So it's when you're using one stimulus promotes a unfavored response. Negative primers lower the speed to the slower than unprimed levels. Positive primers speeds up processing, cause for simpler experiences of the stimuli. Positive primers thought to be caused by spread activation by somatic networks. This means that the first stimulus activates parts of a particular representation. So, here are diagrams. To reference, please use the link. So, Sector Executive has that phonological loop, visual spatial sketchboard, and the episodic buffer. So, Sector Executive uses the phonologic loop for language, the visual spatial for semantics of like a map of a town, an episodic buffer for the short-term memory. For the working memory model is we have input and then the sensory memory with decay and attention that goes to central executive. I can use the visual spatial scratch pad or the phonologic loop, or I can enter long term. So our central is basically our working memory. Autobiography memory is a memory system consisting of episodes collected from an individual's life based on a combination of episodic and semantic memory. I haven't heard this term before, so I'm highlighting. But it makes sense. You want to have a mix of facts and experiences to give an autobiography about yourself. Encoding strategies. Okay, you can remember the idea of what you did, but not the specifics unless you encode and spend effort to do so. So encoding is the strategy for transferring information from your temporary storage into your working memory to a long-term memory to use later. So working memory is processing anything that you're thinking about at that particular moment. So 7 plus or minus 2. So if you want to remember more than 7 things, you need to process that info so it stays in the long-term memory. Coding is more successful when cognitive effect is actively used. Combining encoding strategies is more useful than using only one. Encoding specificity enhances memory when testing takes place for the same conditions as learning. So that's like where you study. If you study in the classroom where you're going to take the exam, you'll do better because you'll remember it better. Rote rehearsal is saying the same thing over and over again. So, like, memorizing a speech, for example, by just repeating the lines over and over again. It requires the least amount of cognitive effort. Chunking, we group info we're getting into a meaningful categories and are easier to memorize. So we can chunk things based on color, like based on colors, banana, oranges, blueberries equals fruits, bread and rice equals grains, by putting them in different categories. So mnemonic devices are linked to what you're trying to learn into previous existing long-term information. Type of mnemonic is imagery, crazier the better, and pegword system. So verbal anchors link words that rhyme with the number. 1 is bun, 2 is shoe, 3 is tree, 4 is door. The ones that we use here have been imagery, because when we want to remember like the opiates from earlier, the one with the T is natural because it's tree. Okay, so moving on to the method of loci. The method of loci is good for remembering things in order, linked info to location. So if you're thinking about you're walking through a grocery store in your head, you're going to link with the different items you'll need. Pegword puts method of loci is using both word cues and locations. Acronyms, each of the letters of popular words you know that stand for the first letter. So example, Holmes equals the different lakes in the US. Self-reference, an acronym that I like to know is Snowdrop for the different DNA, RNA, and protein testing. So self-referencing, think about new information, how it relates to you personally. So that makes sense. So you want to refer to different information, how does it relate to you personally. So a related idea, preparing to teach. So I am a teacher slash tutor in my free time. So preparing to teach ideas that you're learning in this material in order to teach it to someone else. You learn a lot better because you put it in effort in organizing it so you can teach them. That makes sense. So we're self-referring ourselves as a teacher, so we want to learn the content better than normal so that we can teach it to someone. Spacing. Spacing is spreading out study sessions over time in a shorter period rather than cramming them all into one study session. That's not what we're doing here, but we have 9 days to the MCAT, so we're doing our best. We're out here grinding. So we have spaced it out majority of the time. Retrieval. Retrieval is trying to remember or call up a memory of something you've learned before. So we have to start with encoding, and then we're going to have to keep it in our short-term or long-term memory, and then we use retrieval to obtain that memory again. So retrieval depends on different cues to recognize and bring up that information. Priming is a prior activation nodes, talking about our awareness. Like think about hearing a story about an apple and ask the name of word starting with an A. So now reading a story, this is about rabbits, and then hearing the word hair. You're gonna think about the word as hair. Okay, makes sense. Context is the verb you encode and take the test. We already talked about that. So if you study in your classroom and take the test in the classroom, you'll do better. Likely. So state dependent, your state and the moment you encode. When you're in a certain mood, you encode, you can then remember when you're in that same mood. So if you're going to be angry while you take your MCAT, you should study angry. And that's why they always say do not study for exam when you're drunk, because you can't take the exam unless you're drunk to perform in the same manner. Moods can be cued for state-dependent memory. That makes sense. So, we already talked about retrieval, but as a retrieval is anything you can pull something out of your long-term memory and bring into your conscious memory to engage in processing. Probably occurs every time you need to remember a specific fact or detail. So, memory of retrieval from some of the most difficult to easiest. The free recall, could recall, recognition. So free recall is no cues in recalling. And that seems pretty hard because you won't remember specific details. And this is the primacy effect. Will remember the first few on a list, and then the recency is the last few. Hard to remember things in the middle of the list. The recency effect is not as strong if there's interpretation after a list is called. Curve is called the serial position curve. Overall tendency to recall the first few items well, the last few well, and the middle items not so great. Cued recall, or recall cues, having extra clues to remember the word. Still have to produce an answer, but still gets more cues to help you. The added cue helps you retrieve the information from your long-term memory. Gets more retrieval cues tends to be better than free recall. For example, giving you the cue of PI as for the word that's planet. This would be easier. Recognition. The best out of the three tests is easier as recognition. Present two words and say what you heard. Retrieval of the correct word is highly likely. Memory reconstruction, source monitoring, emotional memories. Okay. Brains don't save memories exactly / perfectly. Every time we retrieve a memory, we change it in small ways, according to our goal, mood, or environment. Sometimes these alternates are due to our own desires and moods. If there is a gap in our memory, our brain might fill in with something logical or desirable. Someone tells a story about a fish they caught. Every time they tell the story, the fish gets bigger. Sometimes information retrieved is based on a schema, which is basically a mental blueprint that connects multiple different details together. But there can be false information of inaccurate recollection of events. Experiments done where participants watch a car stop at a yield sign. After the video, participants were given a written description of what happened. And some will recognize it was a stop sign instead of a yield sign. The misleading information example is participants watch a traffic safety and they observe a car crash, and then the participants were asked questions about what happened. The key question was, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Some got the hit and some have smashed. Those who got the word smashed believed there would be grass on the ground, even when there was no grass. False and miscellaneous problematic for police officers to ask leading questions. Even simple phrases can impact recall. When people recall information, they often forget the information source. The error in source monitoring. Can't forget if a yield sign was in the original or written in the description, even if they're able to identify you saw a yield sign or not. Source monitoring can be improved by using more retrieval cues. Discovering an emotional relation extended example, angry with someone but forgot it happened in a dream. Or recognize someone but doesn't know from where. Source amnesia is the inability to remember where or when or something previously learned information has been acquired while chaining to factual knowledge. So, source amnesia could be like you don't remember where you learned how to ride a horse, but you have that knowledge there. Or you don't remember where you learned to ride a bike, but you know that knowledge still. So, emotional memories can be positive and negatively valenced. High emotional memories can feel extremely vivid and are called flashbulb memories. So, emotional memories can also be considered flashbulb memories. Even though they seem real as life, they are still susceptible to reconstruction and are less emotional. Flashbulb memories, people claim to remember details of what they were doing when they received news about an emotional arousing event. Your memory about your birth can be positive valence, while memory of a plane hitting might be negatively. Reconstruction is very drastic, so it's not like everything you remember is a lie. But you should understand that the video is not a video recorder. It's not perfect. The organic connection and neural connection in your brain, which can be altered and reformed each time they are exercised. Inattention is the inability to impact memory formation negatively. Alright. Long-term potentiation and synaptic. Potentiation. Brain doesn't grow new cells to store memories, but endorses neuron strength. Long-term potentiation is an example of synaptic plasticity. Neurons communicate using electrochemical through presynaptic releases. The different sodium, calcium, neural transmission will flow. This is called a potential difference. With repeated stimulation, the same pre stimulates the corridor of postsynaptic synapse. When it lasts longer, it's called a long-term potentiation. In long-term potentiation, the same presynaptic stimulation will elicit a stronger and stronger response in the postsynaptic neuron. This mechanism is what allows for facilitated recollection. In this mechanism, equal levels of presynaptic stimulation result in a greater postsynaptic potential. The greater the postsynaptic potential, the more ion channels will open in the neuron, resulting in a stronger neural response. Neuroplasticity is the change in the brain size, involves functional and environmental influence. Okay, so like babies developing. Decay and interference. Decay is one reason for forgetting. Forgetting happens. When we don't encode something well or don't retrieve it for a while, we can't recall it anymore. One theory is that the pathway between cue and memory becomes weaker over time, a period of disuse which makes it harder to stimulate those neurons. If you learn something once and never revisit it, it's likely to decay over time. Initial rate of forgetting such data is high, but levels off over time. So, Emma Hess was the first person to look at decay in human memory, found his rate forgetting very fast, but he recognized it after initially it leveled out. In his experiment, he memorized 3 letters nonsense syllables. Later, people replicated this experiment with different patterns and time intervals and found that the more anchored the initial memory still follows the same pattern. It takes longer to forget. Most forgetting happens first few days, but after that point, forgetting will level out. Just because you can't retrieve something doesn't mean it's completely gone. One way you can tell if someone has learned something before is called relearning happenings. So even if I couldn't reproduce everything, it took less time to learn the second time around. Found called savings. So savings is when you can reproduce everything that you've done previously, but you have to do it at relearning. Working with procedural skills too, such as a piano. Sometimes interference is a problem through 2 types, retro and active interference. Retro is looking back at old memories to interfering with new content. New learning impairs old information. So, new learning impairs old information stored. Proactive is you learned in the past impairs something in the future. So I had those backwards. So retroactive is new content impairs the past. Proactive is old content impacting new content. So, aging and cognitive abilities. This is debatable because they say different details. Different details about aging and stability. So aging is a natural process when it comes to the changes in the memory. Most people associate age with decline in cognitive things. Some abilities decline, but some retain stable. So aging is not all bad. It does impact certain details about remembering the time of day with an event. Like if you have a meeting at 2 p.m. for older people, it's hard to remember that because it's less important. But let's start with stable. Stable is an implicit memory and recognition memory. So these are implicit memory and recognition memory are stable while aging. Improved is semantic memories until around age 60. So older adults have better verbal skills. Also crystallized IQ is improved. Typically tested by analogous tests and reading comprehension. Also better at emotional reasoning. Decline is a recall becomes more difficult. Episodic memory is impaired. Processing speed and divided attention. Prospective memory is remembering to do things in the future, which is also decreased. So aging and cognitive abilities. Decline is recall, episodic memory, processing speed, and divided attention. Stable is implicit memory and recognition. So implicit memory is riding a bike. Recognition is, it's my grandson. They have improved semantic memory, crystallized IQ, and emotional reasoning. Let's talk about some up to the numbers. Let's finish off these memory things and then we'll stop at cognition. So, Alzheimer's disease and Korsakoff syndrome. Excessive forgetting can be problematic. Dementia is turned for decline of memory and other cognitive functions to the point of interfering with normal daily life. Results from excessive damage to the brain, from strokes or other causes. One common form of issues with memory is Alzheimer's disease. We don't know the exact cause, and it causes neurons to die over time and neurons die off. Cerebral cortex shrinks in size. Alzheimer's disease is a progressive brain disorder that affects different aspects of memory over time. Early symptoms are memory loss, particularly due to retrieval or decode recent memories. In the early stages of Alzheimer's, most patients have difficulty remembering the name of a person they just met. In the early stages of Alzheimer's, most patients can still remember details about their childhood. Most patients can still remember how to use objects to remember general information and learned in their life. So procedural, episodic, and somatic trying to be intact, but more recent events are less. Other symptoms are difficult with attention, planning, semantic memory, and abstract thinking. As it progresses, more severe language difficulties appearing and greater memory loss, such as inability to recognize close fans, family, and friends. They initially have trouble with short-term memory, which eventually progresses into problems with a long-term memory. Continued progression might lead to emotional instability and loss of control over bodily functions. Cause is unknown and disease is terminal. Builds up of amyloid plaques in the brain. Amyloids are misfolded proteins. For you biochemistry people out there. Korsakoff syndrome is caused by a lack of vitamin B1 or thiamine, caused by malnutrition, eating disorders, and especially alcoholism. These groups don't process or absorb all the nutrients they need. Most cases are not caused by brain injuries. Thiamine is important because it converts carbohydrates into glucose cells needed for energy, important for normal functioning of neurons. Refers damage to certain areas that cause poor balance, abnormal eye movement, mild confusion. At this stage, called Wernicke encephaly, a precursor to Korsakoff syndrome. If Wernicke encephaly is diagnosed in time, it can reverse the damage, at least prevent further damage. So if untreated, it'll progress to Korsakoff syndrome. It's going to be a main symptom of severe memory loss. Korsakoff syndrome is not progressive, and unlike Alzheimer's disease, if people are diagnosed, they can be treated, they can get better. Treatment typically can be including thiamine injections such as healthy diet, absent from alcohol, vitamins, and relearn things. Effectiveness depends on the patient, followed by the treatment guidelines. These individuals tend to have retrograde or anterograde amnesia. Retrograde has abilities to recall past events. Anterior is inability to encode new memories. Amnesia means without, also known as amnestic syndrome. It's a deficient in memory caused by the brain damage, disease, or psychological trauma. Amnesia can be caused by various sedatives and hypnotic drugs. Especially amnesia is loss of memory. The memory can be either wholly or partially lost due to extent of damage. Retrograde memory refers to the ability to remember experiences before brain injury. Anterograde, long-term memories after brain. Okay. So, let's continue with semantic networks and spreading activation. Semantic networks are concepts that are organized in your brain as connected ideas. For closely related ideas, they might be closer and longer for them less closely related ideas. We have a hierarchy of semantic networks. First, semantic network theory suggests that we store information in a hierarchy way. We store things in a hierarchy manner. The way thought concepts are organized from a higher order category to lower order categories. We store information at the highest category possible. Broad categories characteristics are stored at the higher level nodes. Supported by the cognitive economy principle, saying our brain is efficient, that how long it takes people to verify certain statements depends on how well they can link ideas together. The longer the distance between nodes or more nodes in between, it takes longer to verify that connection. Problem, but not true for all categories. People tend to categorize a pig as an animal faster than a pig is a mammal. Modified semantic networks is every individual semantic network develops based on experience and knowledge. Some links might be shorter than longer for different individuals, and may be a direct linkage for high order of categories exemplars. Spreading activation says all ideas in your brain are connected together. Pulling up one memory pulls up others as well. So example, saying a fire truck activates truck, fire, and red, which means it's easier to identify and retrieve those. Node link strength is a function of exposure. Increasing exposure increases node link strength. The relative strength of a node links determines the amount of activation emitted in the network or specific node. Stronger nodal links decrease processing time. Learning reduces processing time. And that is all of attention and memory. So we will continue with cognition and the development over time on page 72, or page 74 if you look up here. So I don't even know how long we've been going, but that's the end of it for now.